Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive.
Always fun to dig into these.
Yeah, so today we're going to be checking out this guy, Joe, an American guy who's raising his family in the Philippines.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and our source for this is going to be this really cool interview that he did on a YouTube channel called the Wineding Down Podcast.
Okay, I've heard of that one.
Yeah, and I think you're going to find his take on things uh, pretty interesting.
Yeah, should be a good one.
Definitely. So, it's a really fascinating look at cultural immersion, and he goes so much deeper than, just like the usual like travel blogger,
Right. Yeah, he's not just like, here's 10 tips for whatever.
Exactly.
He's really loving it.
Yeah, and it really gets you thinking about, like identity and belonging and what it actually means to be at home in a place that isn't, your native country.
Yeah. And we're going to kind of unpack why he made this choice in the first place. What were some of the hurdles that he had to face and the unexpected things that he learned along the way?
I'm curious about that for sure. Yeah, and he built businesses there. He had to navigate, all sorts of cultural, quirks and funny mishaps, but then also just raise some really fundamental questions about what does it even mean to be Filipino, in today's world.
Especially today, yeah.
Yeah.
Things are changing so fast.
Yeah,
Globally.
exactly. And I think that last part is especially relevant for you as the listener, because Joe's story isn't just about, one guy's experience. It really touches on these much broader themes of, globalization and cultural exchange and how our own perceptions are shaped by, where we come from, right?
That's always a good one.
Yeah. All right. So let's jump into it. So Joe's journey begins, he meets his wife, who was a Filipina back when they were both in college here in the U.S.
Okay.
And they actually got married before Joe ever even met her family in the Philippines.
Wow. That's pretty unconventional, I would think, especially when you consider, like, in Filipino culture, meeting the family is such a big deal.
Huge. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And he tells this hilarious story about how before the wedding, he and his wife had to hide the fact that they were living together from her parents when they came to visit.
Oh, no.
They were worried about the cultural expectations, around premarital cohabitation and all that.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So it adds,
Yeah.
this whole other layer of complexity to the whole meeting the family,
Yeah.
dynamic.
It's funny, though, like, it must have been so awkward, but also kind of funny at the same time.
Right.
Trying to keep that secret.
I know. It makes you wonder if he felt that pressure even before going to the Philippines.
Yeah.
What was it like when he actually got there?
Right, like, what was the family like
Exactly.
when he actually met them?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's where things get interesting. Despite those initial anxieties, his first impressions of the Philippines were overwhelmingly positive.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
He was totally blown away by how warm and welcoming the people were. And he even contrasts that with a trip that he took to Hong Kong around the same time, where he just felt that people were so much more reserved.
Interesting.
Yeah, it really just shows how much our perception of a place is, based on our interactions with the people there.
I think that's a great point. Like, you go somewhere and you have a couple bad interactions right away, and you're just like, ugh, I hate this place.
Exactly.
But if everyone's like, hey, what's up?
Right. It really colors your whole perception.
Totally.
So it sounds like that initial warmth really kind of shaped his early experience there.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah, but cultural immersion is about more than just those first impressions, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
There's language. And that leads us to this really interesting part of his story. He really wanted his kids to speak Tagalog. But because of all these different logistical challenges, it didn't work out.
Okay.
And they ended up going to French immersion schools, both here in the U.S. and then later on when they moved to the Philippines.
Wow, that's a curveball.
Yeah. I know, it's kind of like you'd think with a Filipina mother that Tagalog would have been a natural fit.
Yeah, you would think, right?
Naturally.
So how did he reconcile that with his desire for his kids to connect with their Filipino heritage?
Yeah, good question.
Well, this is where his perspective kind of challenges some of the conventional notions about this. He believes that loving the country and embracing the people is the core of what it means to be Filipino, regardless of whether you speak Tagalog fluently. And he really pushes back against this idea that language is the sole definer of, like, national identity.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, it is a question, right? Like, what makes someone Filipino? Is it just language or is it something deeper?
Right. Is it bloodlines?
Right.
Is it something deeper, about how you connect with a place and its people?
Yeah. What do you think about that?
I think it's complicated. And I think,
Yeah.
it's something that people feel really strongly about.
Oh,
You
yeah.
know?
Especially in the Philippines where there's so much history of colonization
Right.
and so many languages.
Yeah. That's just like one simple answer.
Right. And so what's interesting is that his view actually resonates with this larger global trend.
Right.
As the world becomes more interconnected,
Right.
the idea of national identity is changing.
It's definitely evolving.
It's becoming more fluid, it's more
Yeah.
inclusive, and less tied to these traditional markers like language or ancestry.
It's more about the feeling,
Exactly.
just checking the boxes.
Yeah, it's not just about checking boxes anymore. It's about a genuine sense of belonging.
Exactly.
But it's important to acknowledge that this kind of evolving view isn't without its own complexities.
Right.
And there are definitely those who, hold a more traditional perspective and place a very high value on, Tagalog fluency as being a defining characteristic
Of course.
of being Filipino.
It'd be interesting to hear from those people, too.
Right.
And why they think that.
Exactly. So I'm curious, how did Joe navigate the nuances of, being an American raising a family in the Philippines, where foreigners sometimes carry certain perceptions?
Ooh, yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah, and it leads to another really intriguing part of his story. He's very open about the fact that as a white American, he did experience a certain level of privilege in the Philippines.
Okay.
Foreigners, especially white
Yeah.
foreigners, are often seen as affluent and exotic, which can lead to, preferential treatment.
Interesting.
Yeah. So it's almost like the outsider status carries a certain allure.
Like a mystique.
Right.
Okay.
It's a dynamic that you see in lots of parts of the world.
Yeah.
And it's rooted in these really complex, historical and social factors.
Right.
But, what's refreshing is that he acknowledges this,
Yeah.
and talks about it pretty candidly.
Yeah, that's good.
He even draws a parallel to his own childhood here in the U.S., where he witnessed, a British classmate get like a disproportionate amount of attention just because of his accent.
Oh, that's fun. I get that, though. I mean, we all kind of have that instinct, right? Like, whatever is different, or like, ooh, what is that?
We're naturally curious about, what's different, what's unfamiliar.
Yeah,
And that curiosity can sometimes manifest in some unexpected ways.
for sure. For sure.
And in his case, that fascination sometimes led to some humorous misunderstandings. He shares these funny stories about misinterpreting Filipino customer service and, people staring, which he initially perceived as harassment, but later realized was just genuine helpfulness.
Right.
And a cultural norm.
It's like they're trying to help you so much, they're like right in your face, and you're like, what do you do?
Back off.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So, it's amazing how cultural context shapes our understanding of behavior, right?
Absolutely.
What might seem intrusive in one culture could be totally normal in another.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, how did he adapt to this kind of constant attention, especially as someone who, had a different social dynamic back home?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we all need our space sometimes, right?
Yeah.
Even when people are being nice, it can be a lot.
Exactly. So, well, this is where his story takes this really fascinating turn. He described how after weeks of this, constant interaction and attention in the Philippines, he actually found this sense of relief in the anonymity of Hong Kong's bustling streets.
Oh, wow.
He was like, I just need some personal space.
Yeah, he wanted to get lost in the crowd.
Exactly. And it makes you realize that, cultural immersion, even when it's positive, can be a process of adjustment.
Oh, for sure.
You know?
Absolutely.
And it highlights that there's so much more to it than just, learning the language and trying the food.
Yeah.
It's about understanding, those unspoken social cues,
Right.
those subtle differences in how people interact.
A whole nother language.
Right. And finding a way to navigate those complexities while staying true to yourself.
You got to find that balance
Exactly.
between the two.
Yeah. So it's about finding that balance between embracing, the new and staying grounded in who you are.
Yeah.
But what happens when that new, becomes your everyday reality?
That's the question.
Joe's been in the Philippines now for over 20 years.
Wow. That's a long time.
I know. And I'm curious, how's he adapted to a place that's constantly changing?
It's a whole other country by now, I'm sure.
Right.
It's changed so much in the last 20 years.
Exactly. Yeah. It makes you
Yeah.
think about
Yeah.
how much the Philippines itself has changed over those 2 decades.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, 20 years is a long time anywhere. But in a place that's developing as rapidly as the Philippines,
Yeah.
I imagine the shifts are even more dramatic.
Oh, absolutely. And Joe definitely touched on that. He mentioned that a lot of the things that he used to miss about the U.S. are now readily available in the Philippines, like everything from specific foods to certain brands to just the general pace of life. Globalization has a way of, homogenizing things to a certain extent.
So in a way, the Philippines that he lives in now is kind of like a different place from the one he first encountered.
Kinda, yeah.
But I imagine it's not just about like the availability of material goods, right?
Right.
There must be deeper kind of cultural shifts happening as well.
You're exactly right. And this is where his observations get really insightful. He talked about the emergence of what he calls Filipino English.
Filipino English.
Like it's its own dialect that's evolved, through this blend of American English with local languages and cultural influences. And it's not just about, having an accent. It's about like unique vocabulary and grammatical structures and even a certain rhythm and flow to the language.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about this Filipino English. What makes it so unique?
Well, for starters, there are certain words and phrases that you just won't find in standard American English. He mentioned hearing the word presidentiable on the news.
Presidentiable.
I'm being totally baffled at first. Like, what does that even mean?
Yeah.
And then you realize it's this word that perfectly captures the Filipino political landscape where like almost anyone with a little bit of name recognition thinks they can run for president.
That's hilarious.
It's like its own category of
Yeah.
person,
Right.
presidentiable.
It's a word that like encapsulates a whole cultural phenomenon.
Exactly. And that's just one example. There are countless others. The way Filipinos use tag questions, the subtle shifts in intonation, even just like the slang terms they use. All of these things contribute to this like really distinctive flavor of Filipino English.
So it sounds like it's this really fascinating linguistic tapestry,
It is.
like woven together from these multiple cultural threads.
Exactly. And it's a testament to just how dynamic language is. Language isn't static. It's constantly evolving and adapting and absorbing influences from the people who use it. And so, in a way, Filipino English is like this reflection of the Philippines' own journey as a nation, its colonial past, its embrace of globalization,
Yep.
and this unique cultural identity that's, both rooted in tradition but also open to change.
Yeah, it's such a powerful way to think about language. Like it's not just a tool for communication.
Right, yeah.
It's like this living, breathing thing that reflects the history and values and experiences of the people who speak it.
Exactly. And in the case of Filipino English, it's a testament to the resilience and adaptability of Filipino culture. Despite centuries of colonization and external influences, the Philippines has managed to retain its own distinct identity, which is now like woven into the very fabric of the language.
Okay, so we've talked about the warm welcome, the challenges of language,
Yeah.
the cultural quirks. But after 20 years, how does Joe actually feel about living in the Philippines?
Yeah.
Does he consider it home?
That's the big question, right? Like
Right.
after all this time.
After all this time, is this home now?
Yeah.
And his answer is a resounding yes.
Wow.
He says that he prefers living in the Philippines over the U.S.
That's a big statement,
It is.
especially considering he's had, the opportunity to live in both places.
He knows both worlds.
Yeah. So what is it about the Philippines that makes him feel so at home?
Well, he talked about the sense of community, the warmth of the people, the
Mhm.
vibrant culture, the beauty of the country itself.
Mm.
He just feels this really deep connection to the place and to the people. Like this sense of belonging that transcends any cultural differences or language barrier.
That's really beautiful.
It's really amazing how someone can find, a true sense of home
Yeah.
in a place that's so different from their, place of origin.
It really speaks to the human spirit, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
Or our ability to adapt and find connection.
Absolutely. It speaks to the power of human connection
Yeah.
and the ability to adapt and embrace new ways of life.
And it kind of brings us back to that whole conversation about Filipino identity,
Huh.
Remember how Joe was saying that loving the country and its people is the core of being Filipino? Well,
Right.
he's like living proof of that.
He's walking the walk.
He's walking the walk. Yeah, he embodies that spirit of inclusivity and embraces the Philippines as his home, not just geographically, but emotionally and culturally.
It's like a beautiful example of how identity can be fluid and expansive.
Yeah,
You don't have to choose one culture over the other.
right.
You can find a way to honor and embrace all the parts of yourself.
Mm-hmm. That's a good message, especially in today's world,
Yeah,
where we're all so mixed up.
exactly. And it challenges us to move beyond these kind of narrow definitions of identity
Yeah,
and embrace, the richness and the complexity of human experience.
for sure.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, from
Mhm.
Joe's initial impressions to, his reflections on language and identity to his long-term adaptation and sense of belonging.
Yeah. It's been a journey.
It has. But there's one more anecdote that I want to touch on before we wrap up.
Okay.
It's a story that really captures his approach to, cultural exchange.
I'm all ears.
Okay, so Joe was on this Filipino TV show, and they were quizzing him on Tagalog phrases.
Oh, fun.
And when they asked him how to tell a jeepney driver to stop,
Right.
instead of using the proper Tagalog,
Hmm.
he, jokingly wrote, "Boy, why?" on his whiteboard.
That's funny.
I know.
Like just yelling, boy.
Right. Tools speaks to, his willingness to engage with Filipino culture,
Yeah.
even if he doesn't always have the language, perfectly down.
Right. He's not afraid to make a little fun of himself.
Right. And it goes beyond just the humor.
Yeah.
It shows a genuine effort to connect,
Yeah.
to bridge that gap and
Yeah.
not take himself too seriously.
I think that's so important.
Yeah.
When you're in a new place, don't be afraid to just put yourself out there
Right.
and make mistakes.
I think that's such a valuable lesson for anyone navigating a new culture,
Yeah, for sure.
and it really ties back to what we were saying earlier about his views on Filipino identity.
Right.
Even though his kids don't speak Tagalog fluently,
Mm-hmm.
he considers them, fully Filipino.
Yeah.
He emphasizes that shared experiences, cultural immersion, love for the country are just as important as language.
It's about absorbing the culture.
It's about the spirit of a place,
Yeah.
not just the technicalities.
Right.
It makes you think, doesn't it?
It does.
What does it really mean to belong somewhere? Is it just about checking off these boxes like language or ancestry? Or is it about something more, intangible?
Yeah, it's a tough one.
It's a question worth pondering, especially in a world where so many of us, have roots in multiple cultures.
Right. Like almost everyone these days
It
has
is
some
right.
kind of multicultural background.
Yeah. And his story really challenges us to broaden our understanding of, identity
Yeah.
and recognize the diverse ways in which people connect with a place and its people.
And their own identities.
Yeah.
It's not just one size fits all.
Exactly.
Everyone's different.
Right. And I think that's a really powerful takeaway from, this whole deep dive.
Oh, yeah.
Joe's experience shows us that, cultural exchange is a journey. It's not a destination.
It's not about the end goal.
Right. It's about being open to new perspectives,
Mm.
embracing the unexpected, and finding those moments of connection that transcend, our differences.
I think that's beautifully said.
Thanks.
Yeah.
And it's about recognizing that identity is not this fixed point, but it's something fluid and ever evolving.
It changes over time,
It does.
as we do.
And it's shaped by our experiences, our relationships, our choices.
All those little things.
Yeah. So as we wrap up, our exploration of Joe's life in the Philippines,
Yeah.
I'm left with this thought. If Joe, an American who initially, didn't even speak Tagalog,
Right.
can find such a deep sense of belonging in the Philippines,
Yeah.
what possibilities exist for the rest of us to connect with, cultures beyond our own?
That's a good question.
How can we bridge those gaps and find common ground even when our backgrounds and languages,
Yeah.
are different?
Right. Even when we seem to have nothing in common,
Exactly.
there's always a way to connect.
Those were questions worth, reflecting on. And I think Joe's story reminds us that, cultural exchange is this enriching and transformative experience.
It changes you
It does.
to the better, I think.
It challenges us to step outside our comfort zone,
Yeah. To grow as people.
to learn and unlearn, and ultimately expand our understanding of what it means to be human.
That's what it's all about.
So we encourage you to continue the conversation.
Yeah.
Think about Joe's journey and what resonates with you. How have your own cultural experiences shaped your perspective on the world?
That's a good one.
And how can you apply Joe's insights to your own life, whether you're traveling to a new country or simply interacting with, people from different backgrounds in your own community?
It's all about those connections.
Yeah, remember, the beauty of a deep dive lies not just in the exploration of knowledge,
Right.
but also in the sharing of perspectives and the creation of these meaningful connections.
Exactly. It's about the community.
So thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
And until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep embracing the beauty of our interconnected world.
See you next time.